I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
Across Asia-Pacific, countries that had once seemed to have the pandemic under control continue to struggle with surging cases. Vietnam.
How will COVID-19 shape our economic future?
Southeast Asia is a vital hub for manufacturing and trade in the world economy, but the region has become a new epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic, with Vietnam, Thailand, and others confronting massive outbreaks of the Delta variant. With China just next door and the U.S. as a vital trading partner, how the region handles this outbreak will be a key signal for trade, inflation, and the global economy. Joining me today is Trinh Nguyen, an economist and non-resident scholar in Carnegie's Asia program. We'll unpack Southeast Asia's battle with the pandemic and the central role the region plays for the global economic recovery. Here we go. Trinh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Trinh, let's get right into it. Southeast Asia is battling a huge COVID outbreak. Indonesia seems to be the new hotspot, but Vietnam, which was once heralded as one of the success stories early in the pandemic, has also seen a huge surge in cases driven by the Delta variant. What happened in Southeast Asia?
Well, the region did really well in the first round, with the exception of Indonesia and the Philippines. They use what we call lockdown or containment policy, and they're still using it while the world has moved on with vaccination. And the issue with containment issues is that you can't sustain this from an economic perspective because you're suppressing mobility domestically, which means suppressing people's means of getting income. And that's a huge problem in Southeast Asia because we also don't have the fiscal support that we see in the US to help these economies. And as a result, the big question is that what impact will have not just on the economy itself, but to the rest of the world because it cannot sustain what's happening at the moment.
So you mentioned the lockdowns. I've heard you talk about this online and in some of your articles as a zero COVID strategy. What is that, and why don't you think it will work in these countries?
Well, in contrast to the West, in Asia, we have what basically means is that we try to have no COVID as possible. And the way you do that is you contain the international borders. This is what Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, many of these economies have done really well in doing that. And when they do that, they then contain it at the border and then contain it from within the country. So it takes two folds. You sacrifice tourism and you sacrifice international mobility, but you have basically a zero COVID zone within it. And Australia is another example that does this. Now, the issue with this is that we have the Delta variant, which is very infectious. And when you have an economy that depends on trade, so even if you have very strict international human mobility, you have merchandise that move back and forth, and you have people moving back and forth through the ports, through the airports, through the engineers that have to fly to check on the supply chain. And that itself creates a huge problem because the Delta variant is very infectious. And so it's very difficult to have zero COVID if you want to do any business at all. So the costs are very high. It's very difficult to sustain because of the mutation of the virus. And therefore, it needs to move to a Western playbook, which is vaccination. And the way you do this is through achieving enough threshold of vaccination, which we do not have in Asia, with the exception of Singapore, and we particularly don't have in Southeast Asia. So we're looking at a very long road to normalization for these economies.
So you mentioned Singapore. Obviously, they're a bit of a standout. So what is it about their strategy that's working so well? Is it that they're just vaccinating more people, they have a smaller population, or are they benefiting because they're a relatively rich country compared to, say, a Vietnam or Thailand?
Well, Singapore hasn't worked out so well. It's just that it can work out so well, right? It achieved 70% vaccination, and it aims to get to this 80% threshold by the end of August. And when it does so, it's already starting to open up, and it needs to open up because it's a very open economy. It's open economy from a service perspective, from a trade perspective, from a financial perspective. And so it depends on people moving in and out, goods moving out in and out. So it cannot sustain this zero COVID strategy, period. And therefore, it moved to vaccination. And it can do so because it's a very small city state and with very high administrative ability. And so the hope is that once it's achieved this, it will normalize. So this suppression that it had to rely on is very short-lived. So that's what I call my silver lining playbook for Asia. And so the rest of the Asian economies will have to answer the question of whether or not they want to get to herd immunity the hard way, potentially the India route where you have a lot of deaths and chaos, or you can do it the gradual way, and which is sustainable, and so that's the rest of Southeast Asia. So we expect Singapore to exit this very quickly. So it's going to exit the zero COVID strategy and move from pandemic to endemic, and that's what I'll hope for the rest of Southeast Asia as well. Because as you probably know, that many of these lockdowns that were supposed to be temporary are being extended. So it continued to have to extend this because cases continue to rise, and it has huge consequence for growth for this region.
Let's talk about the consequences, because I think that's really interesting. I mean, you've got a bunch of pretty, important economies, manufacturing hubs, trade hubs competing here, and essentially competing to emerge from the virus in the best possible way. So what does that mean for their long-term growth if you're successful, like Singapore looks like they'll be, versus if you kind of lag behind?
Well, then your sectors, right, can actually do well. If you're an economy that's open, then you have sectors like hotel, tourism, and all these sectors that need to have customers to be able to normalize. So even the bloodline of the economy, the domestic economy, that's not even mentioning the external sector. One of the key things that people forget is that ASEAN has worked really hard to gain global market share, particularly Vietnam, and it gained even more so last year because it was a poster child for COVID. So as a result, it is not just a short-term hiccup for the region, but it also can have a stain in the longer term, because that means that firms might want to consider diversify from that, right? We just talked about last year diversifying from the China risk. So now we have to talk about diversifying from too much concentration risk elsewhere as well. So that is adding to the burden of the region, not just from a cyclical perspective, but potentially structural.
That makes sense. I guess I'm not the world's greatest economist, but thankfully you're here to unpack this for us. But, I understand a little bit about how global economics is very interconnected. And I know that Southeast Asia is a key kind of engine room for the global economy, especially because of manufacturing. Can you just walk us through, and our listeners through, how when Southeast Asia has challenges like they're having with the coronavirus, it might impact an American consumer, for example?
Of course. The region is an integrated supply chain. So you have Japanese investors investing in Thailand for autos. You have Japanese investing in Malaysia for semiconductor, as well as Malaysians. And then you have South Korean Samsung Electronics investing in Vietnam to make mobile. And then on top of that, you have Taiwanese, Chinese, Koreans investing in Vietnam. Textile manufacturing, because its labor costs are cheap. So as a result of this, you have this interconnected supply chain because of investments these countries have made in the region. And what do these exporters want to do? They then export the goods to where the consumers are. And the U.S. Have the biggest consumer base, is a net importer, biggest net importer of the world, particularly of final goods. China is a big importer of intermediates because it's a manufacturing powerhouse. So imports commodities, but the U.S. imports a lot of footwear, it imports a lot of shirts, it imports a lot of electronics. And so what happens in Southeast Asia has an impact on the final goods, right? Nike has a factory in Vietnam. It actually doesn't. It does it through these suppliers of its goods. Now, if the suppliers have to reduce production because of COVID, because it doesn't have the capacity to create these bubbles that the Vietnamese government want to, or because it has a spike of cases, or for whatever reason, when that happens, and particularly because Vietnam is a huge player in the footwear industry, right? It has a huge global market share in that, and the U.S. imports so much, about a third of its shoes from Vietnam of its total imports. And it's not just the U.S. It's also the Chinese and the South Koreans. So when you're a big global market player like Vietnam in footwear, then what happens to your operation reverberate globally, because then you need to depend on these other areas to increase production, but because your capacity, your market share is so large that the substitution ability of these buyers are not there yet. So it is going to have an impact from a supply perspective, but it's not just that. You have other things that impactful. We all know about the shortages of semiconductor, and that likely to be exacerbated with what's happening in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is not just a cheap labor manufacturing center. It is very key to the semiconductor supply chain. A lot of it is produced in Malaysia, but also in places like Vietnam, the Philippines, etc. And very key for the U.S. because the U.S. imports almost 50% of it from Southeast Asia. And China as well. China imports so much electronics parts from the region. And so what happens there is consequential. And beyond the human disruptions, you can have disruptions that happens to roads in these regions, or you can have disruptions that happens to port in the region. And when that happens, even items that don't require a lot of labor, such as, for example, palm oil, if that somehow have hiccups in shipments, it can also impact the cost of these commodities, which have already risen higher because of the hiccups caused by COVID, and that caused disruption. So supply impact is going to be an issue, and I think that we will see that ASEAN is an important region to the world, and what happens there doesn't impact just ASEAN, but also impact the rest of the world through its key role in electronics, through its key role in labor-intensive manufacturing, such as footwear and textile.
So there's a lot of talk in U.S. politics right now about inflation. Obviously, the U.S. is pumping a ton of money into its economy, and Republican elected officials in particular are becoming very concerned about inflation for the economy and also for their political benefit. Is there a linkage between what's happening with the huge outbreak in Southeast Asia and inflation in the U.S. economy?
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of people talk about the fact that inflation, particularly, if at the Fed, if you want to keep interest rates low, you want to talk about the fact that even though inflation is high, it's temporary, right? And it's temporary or it's transitory because of supply shocks, and supply shocks ultimately should go away once we increase supply, or once they get smoothed out, or once the pandemic is over. Now, we're in August 2021. We still have supply shocks in Southeast Asia, adding to existing supply shocks. So that is going to reverberate in the next several months. So I think the magnitude of it is not going to be huge, but it is going to add to already existing pressures.
You said at one point we were talking, and you said that that the American companies diversified their supply chains away from China out of understanding of political risk that may be associated with the deteriorating U.S.-China bilateral relationship, and many of those manufacturers went to Southeast Asian countries. Now we're in a situation where those countries are really struggling with potential long-term consequences. Is there another place for American companies manufacturing in Asia to go?
When you think about your supply chain, you want to diversify, right? But your diversification is not the only reason for you to move your supply chain. The existing linkages, the policies, the costs associated with it, right? So there's a whole lot of equation that comes into this, right? Of course, they can go to many other places, but at the same time, one of the key reasons why what's happening to ASEAN is key is that it's an established supply chain. So yes, firms can go, and they do, but they do it so in a cost-effective way, and that really depends on the item that you manufacture, right? You may consider going onshore, but labor cost is very expensive in the US. So if you're a labor intensive manufacturer, you're quite sensitive to that. And so the diversification has to take place in economies that have cheap labor, but also not just cheap labor, but an environment that you can have a long term investment. And I think Southeast Asia still has it.
When we come back, I'll ask Trinh about the U.S.-China trade war and strategies the U.S. can adopt to counter Chinese economic influence in Asia. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
About the growing influence of China on the world's economy.
Let's say it may cement China's position as Asia's leading economic power, allowing Beijing to call the shots on important trading terms from Japan to New Zealand.
So in the U.S. foreign policy community, there's an obsession with China, mostly focused around the security competition. But just as important, or perhaps more important, is the economic competition between these two great powers. So how is the Chinese economy doing as they start to emerge from the pandemic? And are they pulling ahead of the United States?
Well, China is doing rather well because they had a huge shock in Q1 and they normalized rather quickly because they use that zero COVID strategy, which contained COVID at the borders. But recently, the Delta variant is also rising there, and they have to resort to suppression measures. The measures are still very targeted and very gentle relative to what happened to Q1 2020, but in itself is going to add to decelerating pressure, right? And added to this, as I mentioned, you have the rise of raw materials. Because of higher demand, also because of supply shocks, because of various reasons. And China being the largest importer of raw materials for both its own consumption and also to produce manufactured goods, is seeing its profit margin eroded, right? Now, if you look at it from an export perspective, they've done really well. 2020 was a good year for China, and so far exports have done pretty well actually across the region. And China's exports, even though it decelerated in July because of the factors I mentioned, they're still in double digits. So rather strong growth rates for that economy.
I want to talk about semiconductors for a second. Besides automobiles and oil, they are the most traded product, counting both imports and exports. And they're a vital part of almost everything we use: phones, computers, cars, any piece of electronic equipment. There's a big, fierce competition going on to produce them now, with China trying to create their own market and own producers for the product to inoculate themselves against influence by countries that produce them now, like the US, Taiwan, and others. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the macroeconomic implications of the semiconductor battle?
So if you look at China's trade relationship with Asia and the US, then you could see that where the US has a surplus is semiconductor, where North Asians, such as the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, have a surplus with China is semiconductor. What that means is that they still have an advantage, right? But that advantage is quickly being eroded, as this is the one area where China wants to move up the value chain. In China's defense, of course, it wants to move up the value chain. The issue is that China's market share of the world export has increased quite a lot. And not only of overall exports, but also its influence in the rest of the world's production, in its ability to export a lot of intermediates. So it's increasingly able to not only being able to produce more and more of its exports using domestic content, it also wants to reduce its reliance on foreign imports, particularly on the higher end of production. So you look at the U.S. Market share, for example, for trade. It's declined over the years, but this is the one area where it still has an edge over China, and as well as the North Asians. And so as a result of this, it sees it as a threat, essentially. And if with enough state support, it's a question of time before they're able to do so. So what that means is that in a global trade point of view, what is left for South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan, or what's left for the U.S. in terms of its competitiveness? And if you don't have a trade competitiveness, can you continue to sustain your ability to generate income in the rest of the world if you don't really have a lot to offer other than what is your natural advantage, which is essentially, if you look at the U.S. export to China or to the world, it's really agriculture, high tech. In terms of manufacturing, a lot of it is very high tech, like airplanes, and in terms of inputs, it retains this. This semiconductor is an area where it has a huge edge, and one where it wants to retain, right? Because it is an input to what people see as the economy of the future. It is already the economy of the now. As you can see that COVID has accelerated this trend, right? To be more digital in everything. So as a result, it is one of the sticking points that we will have to come, because it is China's ambition to be able to do so, to be self-sufficient, right?
Let's turn back to the virus. The pandemic's at a critical point, and you've talked about how the zero COVID strategy is not going to work in a lot of places. So the only option is vaccines. We've seen the United States, the Chinese, and to some degree the Russians donating vaccines in the region. What's the perception in the region of the vaccine effort, and is the United States viewed as a reliable partner for getting people vaccinated?
I would say that what's happening to Southeast Asia is a huge opportunity for the US because of the fact that so many countries don't even have enough vaccines to vaccinate, right? And of course, Pfizer is a popular one, and it's expensive. And you know, in the US, we're talking about a booster shot. But in Vietnam, it doesn't have enough. In the Philippines, it doesn't have enough. In Indonesia, it doesn't have enough, and even Thailand. And let's not forget that even in China, people wants to give a booster shot, a BioNTech. So I think it is an opportunity, not just in terms of competition, but I think collaboration between the U.S. and China, or an opportunity for the U.S. to create goodwill in Southeast Asia, which it has done, right? The Biden administration has donated, but I think more can be done. And I think foreign policy at the moment is really not really the focus. But I do think that there is more opportunity to be able to say that the Indo-Pacific pivot is not just a rhetorical pivot, but we're going to pivot with our wallet too.
We thought we were near the end of the pandemic, and then Delta hit. And for many countries, the US, but also in Southeast Asia, it feels like we're going back to square one. Economists had been predicting a rapid economic recovery, especially with all the vaccines starting to be produced. And now that seems questionable. Is there any end in sight for this pandemic, Trinh?
Well, I told you Singapore is my silver lining playbook, right? Because Singapore is an economy that is very small, it's very open. And if Singapore is able to normalize even marginally and gradually over time, then it is, then we're looking for beyond pandemic into endemic. And I think a country that isn't talked a lot is South Korea. South Korea takes a very different approach. Many people talk a lot about, the US or China or Europe in terms of how we deal with COVID. But South Korea had always taken this not necessarily a zero COVID strategy, or not necessarily we're going to live with COVID India style, but in a more nuanced containment way, right? So it has thousands of cases, but it's not looking to have zero COVID. It is vaccinating, although quite low, and I think it needs to raise its vaccination rate. But it is living with COVID in that it's not restricting its economy. It never had a lockdown. The US, the EU, all these economies had lockdown, but South Korea never did, and I think that can be an example of how we can live with COVID and contain the fallout, not just economically, but socially and psychologically. You see people fighting over each other in real life and on Twitter over whether or not you should wear a mask or not, et cetera, et cetera. But you can have a different way to approach this. At some point, we need to come up with a solution, either totally vaccinate and adopt somewhat of what South Korea does, which is you reach a certain level of vaccination, and even the vaccines don't totally eradicate the virus. You make sure that your public health system doesn't come overrun, and then you have somewhat of a normal life.
Trinh Nguyen, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It was a pleasure, Doug.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.